There's a kind of pain that rarely screams. It doesn't break down in public or demand a diagnosis. It lingers instead quietly and visibly, like a pressure on the soul that few notice, but the one carrying it can't escape. This is the pain of awareness, the pain of the deep thinker, the person who sees too much, feels too deeply, and cannot turn it off. You walk into a room and immediately feel the atmosphere shift. You sense the unspoken tension before anyone says a word. You hear what wasn't said just as clearly as what was. It's not magic, it's not even hyper-empathy. It's awareness of tone, gesture, inconsistency, energy, and once you've developed this lens, you can't take it off. You begin to notice the subtle emotional dissonance behind someone's smile. You sense the sadness in their jokes, the control in their kindness, the fear in their anger. And yet, when you bring up these perceptions, you're often met with confusion, or discomfort, or silence. It's like describing color to someone who's never seen light, and in that moment, something subtle but significant happens. You learn to withhold. You internalize the idea that your awareness isn't welcome, that it's somehow too much. Carl Jung understood this intimately. He wrote that the more intelligent and self-aware a person is, the more they suffer from the general unconsciousness of society. It wasn't praise, it was a warning. Consciousness is heavy. It isolates, because while most people swim comfortably in the shallow end of culture, repeating inherited opinions, laughing at surface-level jokes, reacting from impulse, who live deeper, and depth, by its very nature, removes you from the crowd. Modern psychologist Elaine Aron, in her groundbreaking book The Highly Sensitive Person, echoes this idea. She discovered that approximately 15 to 20% of the population are born with a more finely tuned nervous system. This heightened sensitivity doesn't just apply to physical stimuli like noise or light, applies to emotional and social dynamics as well. Highly sensitive people, or HSPs, are more prone to overstimulation because their minds process information more deeply. They're also more likely to struggle in a culture that values speed over reflection, confidence over curiosity, and performance over authenticity. This means that what feels normal to the average person, a packed schedule, constant small talk, aggressive self-promotion, feels like spiritual violence to a deep thinker. There's no space to breathe, no room to explore nuance, no patience for stillness. And so the deep thinker, the sensitive soul, becomes exhausted not by what they do, but by what they perceive. It's not laziness, it's processing fatigue. Because the brain of a deep thinker isn't just recording life, it's interpreting it, questioning it, feeling the weight of its implications. In the body keeps the score. Trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk describes how deeply felt experiences, especially those that are never validated, become stored in the nervous system. They don't vanish, they build, and for those who feel everything intensely, even subtle invalidation can accumulate into chronic emotional fatigue. So when a deep thinker is told, "You're overthinking it," or "Don't be so sensitive," they aren't just being dismissed, they're being wounded. Their reality is being denied, and yet they carry on, quietly, observing. The world often mistakes their silence for indifference, their solitude for arrogance, their seriousness for sadness, but none of these are quite right. Their silence is often restraint, their solitude is self-preservation, and their seriousness, it's reverence for truth, for meaning, for the inner world that most people never dare to enter. Because here's the paradox. The more clearly you see, the more alone you feel. Not because you're broken, but because your clarity exposes the illusions everyone else depends on. And you start to ask the question that marks every deep thinker's path. If I see so clearly, why do I feel so alone? That's the question we'll keep exploring, not just with Jung, but with every voice age and modern ad has dared to look beneath the surface and say, there's more here. Even if no one else sees it yet. You've been there before. You're sitting at a dinner table. The air is filled with laughter, light conversation, gossip, and passing comments about the weather. It's the kind of setting society calls pleasant, normal, and comfortable. But to you, something feels missing, like a performance without a plot. So you take a chance. You speak up, not to interrupt the flow, but to shift it just a little. You say something real, something about pain, or purpose, or presence, something that didn't come from a meme or the news cycle, something original and honest. And the moment you do, the room changes. You can feel it, even if no one says it. Someone shifts in their seat, someone else reaches for their phone, another person coughs and changes the subject with a cheerful "Anyway." Your words dissolve, unacknowledged. The laughter returns, but you've gone quiet. Not just in voice, but in spirit. Because once again, your depth has landed like a stone in shallow water. What just happened? To the unaware, it's a small social moment. But to a deep thinker, it's something more profound. The realization that you are, in many ways, speaking a different language, one that few are fluent in. Carl Jung once observed that the more an individual is, the more one becomes their true self, the less they are able to connect through conventional social patterns. It's not because they become cold or antisocial. It's because they can no longer play the game of superficiality. They've seen too much to go back to pretending. Susan Cain, author of Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, describes this moment as the price of authenticity. People who prefer depth over display are often met with confusion or resistance. In a society built around extroversion and ease, those who bring intensity and introspection are cast as outsiders not because they're wrong, but because they disrupt the rhythm. Cain explains that most people are conditioned to seek comfort over meaning in social interactions. Chit-chat, humor, and light banter are socially safe. They reinforce belonging. But realness is risky. It asks for presence. It invites reflection. It challenges people to step beyond autopilot, and that kind of conversation, while necessary for the soul, can be threatening to the ego. This is why your honesty lands like a foreign accent in a room full of practiced pleasantries. Your truth doesn't fit. It doesn't blend. It doesn't play by the unspoken rules of surface-level engagement. And so, it's deflected, ignored, or dismissed not maliciously but habitually. People aren't avoiding you. They're avoiding what you bring up in them. In that moment, you may feel like retreating, like toning yourself down. You'll tell yourself, maybe I shouldn't have said anything, maybe I am too intense. But let me tell you something you must not forget. You are not too intense. The room was just too quiet. You weren't loud, you were honest. And honesty always sounds louder in spaces designed for silence. Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor and author of Man's Search for Meaning, said that when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves, but not by becoming someone we're not. The change he spoke of was internal, an expansion of spirit, a sharpening of clarity, a deeper resolve to carry truth even when it is inconvenient. That is what you're doing in those awkward silences. You are holding the line. You are staying true. You are choosing integrity over imitation. And yes, it's lonely, because the moment you begin to speak your truth fluently, you start to realize how few people actually understand the language of depth, of thoughtfulness, of the unsaid. But here's the strange miracle. Somewhere, someone else is speaking that same language alone in another room, wondering if they're the only one. And your courage to keep speaking may one day be the signal they've been waiting for. Most people think that waking up is liberating, and it is. But they forget what comes next. Once you wake up, really wake up, you begin to see not just the beauty but the cracks, not just the colors, but the shadows beneath them. And suddenly, the world no longer feels safe, predictable, or even sane. It feels absurd. Plastic, almost artificial. You find yourself staring at a billboard or a corporate slogan and thinking, do people actually believe this? And the answer is often yes, because they're still asleep. Carl Jung didn't romanticize awakening. He warned against its glamour. In his lectures and writings, Jung consistently spoke about the weight of self-awareness not as a virtue badge, but as a burden. To become conscious of oneself, he wrote, is a trial, a suffering, a burden, and a danger. That danger, he explained, lies not in what you become but in what you can no longer unsee. The cost of seeing reality as it is without illusion, denial, or sugarcoating is high. Suddenly you realize that many people aren't making choices, they're repeating patterns. They're not forming beliefs, they're absorbing dogmas. They're not free, they're conditioned. And the more conscious you become, the more alien the world begins to feel. Why? Because you're no longer part of the mass. You no longer nod on cue. You no longer worship at the altar of what's trending, efficient, or easy. You've left the collective dreamland now. You're awake in a room full of sleepers. Friedrich Nietzsche captured this dilemma with painful clarity when he said, and those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music. When you step outside the consensus trance, you begin to speak in symbols, truths, and intuitions that others don't recognize. They hear your words, but they don't feel your frequency. And often, they react not with curiosity, but with discomfort or disdain. Awakening, then, is not just clarity. It's loneliness. The philosopher Alan Watts once remarked, waking up to who you are requires letting go of who you imagine yourself to be. But it also requires letting go of who the world wants you to be. The agreeable version, the pleasant version, the marketable version. Once you begin peeling back the layers, you'll find that much of your personality was shaped for social survival, not truth. And that realization hurts. You'll see it in friendships that suddenly feel hollow, in family traditions that seem more like rituals of denial, in workplaces that praise loyalty but punish originality. You'll feel a growing dissonance between who you were told to be and who you actually are. This is what Jung meant when he said that individuation, the process of becoming your true self, is a form of suffering, because the path of awakening is not linear. It's not a climb. It's a death. The death of comfort, the death of consensus, the death of unconscious belonging. You begin to outgrow your past self, but not everyone around you is growing with you. So you try to share what you've learned. You try to bring others into the light. And sometimes it works, but more often it doesn't. Because people don't want clarity, they want comfort. They don't want a new lens. They want reassurance that their old one still works. and so your awakening becomes isolating. But here's the paradox. What isolates you also liberates you, because once you step out of the collective illusion, you start to see people, see systems, see yourself as they truly are. It's raw, it's painful, but it's real. And real, Jung believed, is the beginning of healing. Because the world doesn't need more followers of the dream. It needs those who have awakened from it and chosen, in spite of the loneliness, to stay awake. Depth doesn't begin in adulthood. It begins in childhood quietly, innocently, but unmistakably. A child asks, why do people lie? Or why do I feel sad when everyone else is laughing? They notice when parents say one thing but feel another. They sense tension in a room before it erupts. They cry not just from scraped knees but from watching someone else cry. They feel the weight of invisible things, mood, silence, hypocrisy, and for this, they are often punished. Not physically, but emotionally. They're called too sensitive, too dramatic, or too curious. Their honest questions are shut down. Their intuition is dismissed. Their emotional depth is pathetic. And so, very early, they begin to learn that being fully awake in a sleeping world is not safe. Carl Jung believed that the child's psyche is more open to the unconscious than the adult's. In his view, the child is still close to the soul's origin, intuitive, imaginative, symbolically alive. But this openness, he warned, is exactly what makes them vulnerable. The child sees things adults have long since learned to block out. They feel the dissonance between what's said and what's real. And in many families, that level of perception is deeply threatening. Why? Because it exposes the unresolved trauma in the adults. Alice Miller, in her landmark work, The Drama of the Gifted Child, revealed that many emotionally perceptive children unconsciously take on the emotional burden of their parents. They become the good child, the wise child, or the quiet child, not because it's their nature, but because it keeps the family system from unraveling. These children aren't gifted in the academic sense, they're gifted in perception. They notice too much, they care too deeply, and in doing so, they absorb pain that isn't theirs. They become emotional barometers in homes that are often emotionally repressed. Miller warns that these children grow up to be adults who distrust their own feelings. They were taught, subtly but consistently, that their inner truth was dangerous, so they learned to suppress it. And the tragedy is this. In protecting the family's illusion, they lost connection to their own authenticity. Psychologist Gabor expands this idea by arguing that children will always choose attachment over authenticity. In order to survive emotionally, physically, spiritually, a child will suppress what they feel. If it threatens their bond with a parent or caregiver, a deep-thinking child who asks, why is dad angry all the time? Or why doesn't mom look at me when she's sad? Might stop asking not because they found the answer, but because the question itself disrupted the attachment bond. In other words, the child learns, my truth threatens my belonging. That's where the fracture begins, not in adulthood, but at age 4, or 7, or 10, when the child realizes they must perform in order to be loved. They must smile when they want to cry, numb when they want to feel, nod when they want to scream. The soul begins to splinter not from trauma alone, but from the unacknowledged truth of trauma. Jordan Peterson, in his lectures on child development and archetypes, notes that the child is the foundation of psychological development, not just biologically, but symbolically. If the child within is silenced, neglected, or shamed, the adult becomes fragmented. Speak the truth, or at least don't lie, he says. But for many deep thinkers, that advice feels like a luxury they couldn't afford growing up. And so, by the time they reach adulthood, deep thinkers have built entire inner worlds rich in thought, feeling, and meaning, but often hidden, walled off, protected. Not because they are secretive, but because they learned long ago that revealing the inner world was dangerous. And that's the tragedy. They learn to mistrust the very gift that made them feel alive. But there's hope, because even if childhood was where depth became dangerous, adulthood is where it can become sacred. By the time a deep thinker reaches adulthood, something strange has happened. They've built a vast world inside themselves, layered, luminous, shadowed, mysterious. A world of questions without easy answers. A world that holds paradox, contradiction, and beauty all at once. This inner world is not an escape. It's not fantasy. It's refuge crafted piece by piece over years of feeling out of place in the external one. Because the outside world, it often doesn't make sense to them. It moves too fast, praises too shallowly, rewards imitation over imagination. In school, they were told to sit still and memorize. At work, they're asked to follow scripts and time. In relationships, they're expected to be emotionally normal, which usually means being less sensitive, less intense, less intuitive. They start to realize, this world wasn't built with someone like me in mind. So, they retreat not in bitterness, but in self. They go inward, into the space where meaning lives, where unspoken truths are welcome, where nothing has to be filtered for consumption. This is the birth of the inner sanctuary. Carl Jung believed that every individual has within them an unconscious realm, what he called the self, that seeks expression. Not the ego self that plays roles and navigates society, but the deep, archetypal self that holds the blueprint of who we truly are. When the outer world fails to mirror or understand that self, the individual retreats into it. And in doing so, they begin the long, sacred work of individuation. But this creates tension, because now you live in two worlds. On the surface, you wear the mask what Jung called the persona, the socially acceptable version of you that knows how to nod politely, meet deadlines, and say I'm fine when you're anything but. But beneath the mask is a deeper voice, a richer language, a sacred fire that cannot be fully extinguished. And these two worlds are not easily reconciled. In man's search for meaning, Viktor Frankl describes how even in the most brutal, senseless, external conditions like a concentration camp there remains an inner world of choice and value. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing. The last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Deep thinkers understand this intuitively. When the outer world feels hollow or hostile, the inner world becomes a site of agency, of meaning-making, but there's a danger too. Because when the outer world feels threatening and the inner world feels safe, you can begin to over-identify with your inner reality. You become a philosopher in solitude, a mystic in a marketplace. You might avoid real-world messiness in favor of metaphysical clarity. And slowly, without meaning to, the inner world becomes not just a refuge but a prison. James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist, warned against using introspection as avoidance. He believed the soul doesn't just want to go inward, it wants to engage, to wrestle with the world, to turn inner insight into outer embodiment, to bring the fire out of the cave and into the village, even if the village is afraid of fire. But how? The answer lies in what Clarissa Pinkola calls walking in two worlds. In her book Women Who Run with the Wolves, she writes of the wild soul as one who maintains contact with the deep instinctual truths and still shows up in the everyday. These are the ones who stir the pot, who speak uncomfortable truths, who refuse to flatten themselves to fit. They carry the scent of the forest into boardrooms. They bring silence into noise. They carry myth into marketing. So, if you've ever felt like you live behind glass watching the world but not quite in it, or not alone, you've simply been nurturing something sacred, something real. And maybe now, the time has come to let the two worlds meet. The world inside you is vast, but it was never meant to stay hidden. It was meant to transform the world outside. There's a reason deep thinkers often walk alone. It's not because they want to. It's because, whether they realize it or not, they carry something that terrifies most people. Not the kind that flatters, not the kind that filters, but the kind that reflects exactly what's been buried, ignored, denied, or disowned. And that kind of mirror, people don't want to look into it. Because what they see staring back is not just you, it's them, without the mask. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the unconscious part of ourselves made up of everything we repress. Our rage, our fear, our envy, our despair, our unmet needs, our rejected impulses. The shadow isn't evil, it's human. But because it's uncomfortable, most people exile it. They build an identity that seems functional, acceptable, even impressive. But underneath, the shadow waits. And here's the hard truth. When a deep thinker walks into a room, perceptive, honest, they often activate the shadow in others without saying a word. Your presence alone is disruptive. Because you don't laugh on cue. You don't perform the expected small talk. You see too much. You listen too closely. You notice not just what someone says, but how they say it, and what they're not saying at all. You ask questions people don't want to answer, not because they're inappropriate, but because they're true. And that's the thing about truth. It doesn't require confrontation to be confrontational. It simply exists, and its existence is often enough to stir discomfort in those who've built their lives on denial. As poet Robert Bly once wrote in a little book on the human shadow, every time we suppress a part of ourselves, it goes into a long bag we drag behind us. We carry this bag of shadows through life, hidden shame, unresolved grief, secret fantasies, and most people will do anything to avoid looking inside. But deep thinkers, they open that bag, they study it, they integrate what's inside. And that process of turning shadow into insight terrifies those who haven't even acknowledged their bag exists. This is why people reject those who reflect too much. It's not you they fear. It's their own unfinished business that you unconsciously shine a light on. Friedrich Nietzsche touched on this when he wrote, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you." Most people never gaze into their abyss. But when they see that you have, when they sense your intimacy with depth, they instinctively recoil, not out of hatred, but out of fear. You are, in effect, a living challenge to their comfort zone. James Baldwin, who understood both societal oppression and personal truth at a cellular level, said it best. You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read, and then you meet someone like you, someone who has felt it, not just studied it, someone who speaks from the scar, not just the theory. That's what deep thinkers represent. Not knowledge, but integration. Not performance, but presence. Not answers, but willingness to ask the forbidden questions. And because of this, you will trigger defensiveness. Some will mock you, others will distance themselves. A few will attack, not because you did something wrong but because you reminded them of what they've been running from. And here's where the pain sets in. You weren't trying to provoke anything. You were just being real. But in a society that fears its own reflection, being real is the most dangerous thing you can do. So if you've ever been pushed away for your insight, ghosted for your honesty, or misunderstood for your silence, know this. You weren't rejected because you were wrong. You were rejected because you were right. Because in a world where the shadow rules in silence, the one who names it becomes the villain. But Jung believed that naming the shadow is the first step to wholeness. And maybe your presence isn't a threat at all. Maybe it's the invitation they didn't know they needed. There's a question deep thinkers ask themselves more often than they admit. Why am I always so tired? Not physically, not from work, but from people, from the constant weight of conversations, the subtle tension in interactions, the sense of walking through emotional fields no one else seems to notice. You go into a room and you feel everything. Someone smiles and you hear the sadness beneath it. Someone talks confidently and you sense the fear in their voice. Someone vents their frustrations to you and leaves lighter, but you feel heavier. This is not your imagination. It's not weakness. It's the cost of carrying what others can't. Carl Jung explained that we project what we cannot accept in ourselves onto others. The qualities we deny, suppress, or disown. Our shadow aspects don't disappear. Instead, they show up in the people around us. We unconsciously assign our unacknowledged feelings to others, blaming them for what lives inside us. And who becomes the favorite target of this projection? The deep thinker, the empath, the one who sees clearly but speaks softly, the one who listens without judgment, who understands without needing to be told. You, to others, you feel safe, like a mirror that doesn't punish, but that safety becomes a trap. People start using you, not out of malice, but out of unconscious hunger. They pour their emotions into you without invitation. They process their pain through your presence, and when they leave they feel better. But you feel drained. Psychologist Gabor, in When the Body Says No, explores how emotionally attuned individuals, especially those conditioned in childhood to suppress their own needs, often. You may have learned early in life that love is earned through caretaking, that being quiet, helpful, and emotionally available makes you lovable. So now, as an adult, your boundaries are blurred. You're not just compassionate, and over time, this leads to a silent kind of burnout. It is not the burnout that comes from doing too much, it's the kind that comes from feeling too much without reciprocity. People come to you for clarity, for comfort, for catharsis. But when you need space, when you say I'm not available right now, or set a boundary, or pull away to rest, suddenly you're labeled cold, distant, difficult, selfish. But they're not seeing the full picture. They're not seeing how long you've carried what wasn't yours, how often you've said I'm fine when you weren't, how deeply you've listened while longing to be heard, how you've become the emotional anchor in other people's storms while quietly drowning in your own. And here's the real tragedy. When you've been everyone else's safe space for so long, no one thinks to ask where your safe space is. Marshall Rosenberg, the creator of nonviolent communication, once said, "Empathy gives you a hearing, honesty gives you healing." But in a world where empathy is expected only from certain people, often women, often the sensitive, often the wise, honesty becomes a luxury. You're allowed to listen, but not speak. You're allowed to hold space, but not take up space. And so, you grow tired, not just of people, but of always being the strong one, the calm one, the one who has it all together. Because you never did. You were just quiet about it. Clarissa Pinkola warns that when healers and deep feelers deny their own needs long enough, their gifts become wounds. Their empathy becomes a liability. Their inner well runs dry. And when that happens, the world doesn't rush in to fill it. It just asks for more. So what do? You start reclaiming your energy. You stop mistaking emotional labor for love. You stop calling overexertion compassion. You stop offering yourself to people who only come around when they're empty. And you start remembering that your energy is sacred. Not everyone deserves access to it. You've heard it before. You're too sensitive. You think too much. You take things too seriously. You're too intense. It's never framed as cruelty. It often comes disguised as advice or concern. But the message is clear. You are too much. And over time, that message starts to sink in. You begin to wonder, what if they're right? What if I really am the problem? What if I need to be less emotional, less curious, less into? But here's what you must know. Too much is a lie. It's not a reflection of your excess. It's a reflection of their limit. When someone tells you you're too much, what they're really saying is, I can't hold what you carry. Or, more truthfully, your depth makes me uncomfortable. Carl Jung wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid confronting their own souls. When you live from a place of depth, when you speak from the gut and feel from the marrow, you unintentionally force people to confront parts of themselves they've long silenced. It's not personal, it's energetic. You become the reminder of what they've exiled. And that reminder hurts. So instead of expanding to meet you, they shrink you to fit them. This is especially true in cultures that equate composure with strength, logic with value, and silence with grace. Emotion is mistrusted. Vulnerability is mistaken for weakness. Intensity is misread as instability. And those who speak with emotional clarity are often accused of making others uncomfortable even when all they're doing is telling the truth. Thomas More, in Care of the Soul, writes that emotional richness is not a defect to overcome, but a depth to be honored. He says that the soul thrives not in perfection, but in complexity in the places where pain and wonder coexist. Your sensitivity isn't a flaw. It's your access point to truth, to creativity, to the sacred. But this culture does not reward soulfulness. It rewards performance. It celebrates those who fit neatly into roles, who smile when they're supposed to, speak only when invited, and never challenge the norm. So when someone shows up with a raw, undiluted presence, they're labeled inconvenient, disruptive, difficult. But disruptive to what? Two systems built on disconnection, two relationships built on codependence, two workplaces built on suppression, two friendships built on keeping things light. Brown reminds us that vulnerability is not weakness, it's courage. And often, that courage goes unseen, because it doesn't always look like grand speeches or public tears. Sometimes, it looks like quietly telling the truth when it would be easier to lie, or choosing solitude rather than shrink yourself for connection, or walking away from a relationship because your emotional needs were not a priority. These are acts of self, and they are often misunderstood. Bell Hooks wrote that love and truth are intertwined, that to love someone truly is to allow them the space to be fully themselves. But when people haven't learned to love themselves, they will try to shrink anything that feels unfamiliar. So your too much isn't the problem. It's the mirror. You are not too much. You are precisely as you were meant to be: sensitive, sharp, intuitive, soulful. You were never designed to live on the surface. You were built for the depths. And yes, it makes you harder to relate to, but it also makes you capable of relating to life in a way most people never touch. You see beauty others miss. You feel pain others bear. You ask questions others avoid. You're not here to be that. You're here to be real. So stop shrinking to be tolerated. Stop editing your truth for comfort. Stop apologizing for your fire. Your intensity isn't the problem. It's the evidence that you're alive. And in a world that's half asleep, aliveness is always misunderstood. From the moment you are born, society begins to hand you a script. This is who you are. This is what you're supposed to believe. This is what success looks like. This is how you behave to be loved. These are your heroes. These are your villains. These are the stories you must live by. And at first, you accept the script. How could you not? You're a child, trusting, absorbing, eager to belong. You're not taught how to think. You're taught what to think. You learn quickly that questions are threatening, that silence is rewarded, and that memorizing the right answers brings pleasure on if you don't understand them. Carl Jung called this conditioned mass-mindedness the psychological state in which the individual loses their sense of self and the collective identity. It's a kind of trance. You don't even know you're in it until something wakes you up: a crisis, a heartbreak, a book, a dream, or maybe just the unbearable sense that you're living someone else's life. Most people never reach that moment. They stay in the dream, moving through life on autopilot. They believe what the group believes. They chase what the group chases. They fear what the group fears. They laugh when they're supposed to, work when they're told to, and die, having never asked if any of it was true. This is not an accident. Aldous Huxley, in Brave New World, warned that the most dangerous form of control is not oppression but distraction. He predicted a society where people would no longer fight for freedom, because they would be too busy being entertained, not forced into silence, but numbed into submission, not censored, but overstimulated until truth becomes just another flavor in the algorithm easily swiped past. And it's happening now. Look around. The culture rewards obedience, not originality. Trending opinions, not critical thinking. Shallow positivity, not radical truth. School teaches conformity. Media teaches fear. Social platforms reward surface. And most conversations are rehearsals of inherited thoughts. As Noam Chomsky observed, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. So you're allowed to argue, you're allowed to choose sides, but you're not allowed to question the frame itself. You can ask, which political party is better? But not, is this system serving us at all? You can ask, how do I become successful? But not, who defines success for me and why? You can ask, how do I make more money? But not, what is money doing to my soul? This is the invisible cage. And deep thinkers feel it early. Even as children, they start to ask dangerous questions. Why are things this way? What if we did it differently? Why do adults lie so much? But instead of being encouraged, they're corrected, conditioned, trained to stop thinking outside the script. Not because the adults are evil, but because they were never taught how to leave the dream either. Krishnamurti, the Indian philosopher, once said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." And yet that's the goal of modern culture, to make you fit into something that's disconnected from nature, soul, and truth. So what happens when you don't fit? You're labeled rebellious, difficult, negative. You're told to just be grateful, Just be positive. Just play the game. And when you refuse, when you choose reflection over reaction, questioning over blind faith, stillness over stimulation, you become a threat to the system. But that's the beginning of freedom, because waking up from the collective dream isn't rebellion. It's return. Return to your inner compass, to your capacity to think, to feel, to choose, not reactively but consciously. Jung believed that only the individuated person, the one who has awakened from mass-mindedness, can become whole. And a society filled with whole individuals is the only kind worth living in. You may walk alone for a while, but you won't walk asleep. There's something unsettling about a person who simply sits still, not scrolling, not talking, just being quietly present, not zoning out, but tuned in, not frozen, but grounded. In a world addicted to motion, stillness doesn't look peaceful. It looks suspicious. We live in a society that measures worth by speed, productivity, responsiveness, how fast you can text back, how many tabs you have open. So when someone isn't rushing, isn't broadcasting, isn't reacting, and breaking the pattern makes people nervous. Deep thinkers often do just that. They listen longer than others are comfortable with. They pause before responding. They observe instead of performing. Their energy doesn't fill the space, it opens it. They don't dominate the room. They shift its frequency, and that shift can be Carl Jung believed that every person carries within them an unconscious discomfort with the unknown. When you meet someone who doesn't fit into a recognizable social rhythm, someone whose stillness feels like it sees through you, it triggers that discomfort. Not because of what they do, but because of what they don't do. They don't flatter, they don't interrupt, they don't engage in emotional theater. And that absence becomes a mirror that reflects everything others are trying to distract themselves from. This is why stillness, especially in a deep thinker, is often mistaken for judgment. People assume, if you're not talking, you must be analyzing me. If you're not laughing, you must be judging me. If you're not busy, you must be lost. But that's projection. What they're really saying is, your calm is revealing my chaos. Rollo May, in Man's Search for Himself, described the modern person as a being who feels himself lost in the world. He argued that much of our anxiety comes not from external pressure, but from internal emptiness, a lack of connection to one's own soul. And when a person who is soul-connected walks into the room, their presence alone disturbs the silence others have been desperately trying to fill. Because here's what stillness does. It exposes the performative nature of most interactions. It exposes the shallowness of compulsive busyness. It exposes the collective fear of silence, which is always, at its core, a fear of self. Eckhart Tolle, in The Power of Now, writes that most people are terrified of the present moment because it contains everything: their suppressed feelings, unresolved grief, unmet needs. So they escape into thought, noise, activity. But deep thinkers often live in the present. They're not rushing to escape. They're resting there. This resting presence carries power, not the loud, aggressive kind, but the magnetic, unsettling kind. The kind that doesn't demand attention but draws it anyway. Because true stillness is rare. It's not the absence of movement. It's the presence of self. Alan Watts once said, "Muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone." The deep thinker is the one who doesn't stir the surface for show. They let things settle. And in that settling, truth rises. Insight emerges. Pain becomes visible. And for many, that's too much to bear. So they turn away, they change the subject, they label the still one weird, intense, or quietly arrogant. But what they're really reacting to is depth, because in a shallow world, depth feels dangerous. But let this be a reminder. Your stillness is not judgment. Your quiet is not rejection. Your presence is not a threat. It is medicine, not for those who want more noise, but for those who are ready, maybe for the first time, to hear themselves think. And that's what makes your energy powerful. You push, you don't preach, you simply up. And in being fully yourself, you remind others of what they've lost. You're not suspicious. You are sacred. We live in an age of performance. Smiles are curated. Emotions are filtered. Outrage is timed. Even vulnerability is often rehearsed for public applause. Every interaction has a subtext. See me. And yet, the moment someone shows up raw, unfiltered, and real, they're seen not as refreshing, but as threatening. That's the paradox of the modern world. Everyone says they want authenticity, but very few can actually handle it. Deep thinkers don't perform well. Not because they're incapable, but because it feels like betrayal. To act for the sake of acceptance, to twist your truth into a more palatable shape, hurts more than rejection ever could. So they show up as they are, with unresolved thoughts, complex feelings, half-finished ideas, and wide-open questions. And the world doesn't know what to do with that. Carl Jung observed that people fear what lies beneath the surface of the self. Realness demands depth, and depth demands confrontation with pain, with contradiction, with inner shadows. When someone refuses to perform the social script, they create friction, because the collective illusion relies on everyone playing along. So when one person says, "This doesn't feel real," They threaten the structure. Brown calls this the vulnerability hangover. It's what happens when you reveal a piece of your truth in a room that was only pretending to be safe. You speak honestly about your pain, your confusion, your joy. Enter room flinches. They change the subject. You feel it, that sudden coldness, and you start wondering, was I too much, too raw, too real? But know what you were, was awake. And awakeness in a sleeping society is a radical act. Erich Fromm, in The Sane Society, argued that in a culture built on consumption and conformity, sanity is redefined to mean fitting in. Being normal becomes more important than being true. He wrote, "The fact that millions of people share the same forms of mental pathology does not make these people sane." In other words, the problem isn't your intensity. It's that we've normalized disconnection and called it functionality. In this performative landscape, truth becomes dangerous. To say, "I don't know who I am right now," or "I feel lost," or "this life I've built doesn't feel like mine," is heresy in a world that worships certainty, control, and clean narratives. But deep thinkers don't live in clean narratives. They live in the messy middle, the liminal spaces, the inner wilderness. They don't offer packaged solutions. They ask inconvenient questions. They don't polish their pain. They express it honestly. They don't always know the answer, but they refuse to lie to themselves just to appear confident. And this kind of presence is not just rare, it's rebellious. Because it breaks the fourth wall of culture. It reminds others that the emperor has no clothes, that the influencer is lonely, that the system is rigged, that the world is full of noise, but starving for truth. Audre Lorde said, "When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak." The deep thinker knows this, and though they fear being misunderstood, they fear disappearing even more. So they speak, even when it trembles, even when it costs them friends, promotions, invitations, because some truths are worth more than comfort, and some souls cannot survive behind a mask. So if you've ever felt like your realness was unwelcome, if people praised your silence but recoiled at your honesty, know this: you are not defective. You are disruptive, and that's exactly what the soul of this age needs. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being awake in a world that is half asleep. It's the loneliness of seeing what others don't, feeling what others won't, and knowing what others are trying to forget. You walk through life with eyes wide open, watching patterns repeat, hearing the unspoken meanings behind people's words, feeling the heaviness others refuse to name. You carry awareness like a torch, and often that torch becomes your isolation. Carl Jung once said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." You could be surrounded by friends, family, co-workers, but if you can't share what truly matters to you, if your inner world has no bridge to the outer one, you will feel like a stranger in your own life. This is not the loneliness of absence. It's the loneliness of misalignment. You try to share your thoughts about meaning, about pain, about the complexity of existence, and people nod politely or change the subject. You try to express your depth and are told you're too intense or too serious, so you begin to withhold. You edit your truth. You water down your questions. You nod along to conversations that don't nourish you. And inside you ache not for company, but for connection. That ache has a name: existential solitude. Jean-Paul Sartre called this the human condition's inescapable experience of being a self in a world of others. We long to be understood, yet our deepest truths are often The more aware you become, the more you notice how much communication is performance, how much interaction is avoidance. You become fluent in a language few others speak, the language of nuance, of depth, of soul. And when no one speaks it back to you, the silence is deafening. This is why many deep thinkers are drawn to solitude, not because they hate people, but because silence is more honest than pretense. It's why they walk alone in nature, get lost in books, write in journals, stare at the stars. These aren't escapes, they're returns, a way to come back to themselves when the world feels too artificial to breathe in. But even in this solitude, the act remains. Because being awake means you see the world as it is, and that includes the beauty and the tragedy. You notice the small kindnesses that go unseen, but also the quiet cruelty that goes unchecked. You feel the hope in humanity, but also the weight of its self-destruction. You carry paradox like second skin, and that complexity, it's hard to hold alone. Hermann Hesse wrote of the two souls within one breast, the soul that longs for transcendence and the one that longs to belong. This split defines the deep thinker. You want to find others like you, but you also know that few will understand. So you float between worlds, never quite home, never quite gone. But in that in-between space, something sacred happens. You begin to know yourself. You stop performing. You stop chasing validation. You stop trying to be understood by those who only want the version of you that doesn't ask too much. You start to belong to yourself. Rainer Maria Rilke called this sacred solitude, the space where one can be the guardian of their own solitude. He believed that loneliness wasn't something to be feared, but entered a chamber of transformation where the soul deepens. Because in that silence, without distractions or applause, you meet the one person who has always been waiting for your truth. And once you know yourself in this way, truly know, you'll never feel entirely alone again. Because you'll have touched something within that no rejection, no misunderstanding, no silence can take away. You are awake. And though it may be lonely, it is also free. The modern world is loud. It hums and blinks and scrolls and updates, constantly pulling your attention outward. Algorithms whisper in your ear, don't think, don't feel, just keep going, keep watching, keep buying. And for the average person, this system works. It numbs just enough, distracts just enough, entertains just enough. But if you're a deep thinker, it doesn't work for long, because you see it, you feel it, you recognize the psychological sleight of hand, how media doesn't just reflect culture, but creates it, how entertainment isn't neutral, it's narrative control, and how the more connected we seem online, the more disconnected we actually become from ourselves. Carl Jung warned about the unconscious mind being hijacked by mass influence. He saw that in every era, there are forces at work: religions, ideologies, technologies that aim to shape human thought without the individual realizing it. In our age, those forces aren't confined to pulpits or propaganda. They live in our pockets. Every app, every feed, every alert is engineered to interrupt your attention and reroute it towards someone else's agenda. The modern mind is not protected. It's exposed open source consciousness, available to the highest bidder. Neil Postman, in his prophetic book Amusing Ourselves to Death, explained that the danger of media isn't just what it tells you, it's what it prevents you from thinking about. When everything becomes entertainment, truth becomes a vibe, suffering becomes content, depth becomes irrelevant. And in that landscape, the deep thinker struggles to breathe. You scroll past tragedy, past spiritual insight. The algorithms don't reward reflection. They reward reaction, outrage, instant opinions. Everything is fast, flattened, and filtered. But your mind doesn't operate that way. You see through headlines, you pause at contradictions. You wonder about the implications no one is mentioning. A 30-second clip on grief sends you into a 3-hour reflection. A throwaway meme about ambition triggers a philosophical inquiry. A political post doesn't just make you angry, it makes you curious. You want to know the roots, the systems, the archetypes behind it all. And this makes the media landscape exhausting, because you're not consuming passively. You're processing, you're internalizing, and feeling in an overstimulated world becomes a liability. Sherry Turkle, author of Alone Together, argues that digital life creates a paradox. We are constantly in contact, yet increasingly afraid of intimacy. The curated self becomes a mask we forget we're wearing. The comment replaces the conversation. And in this world of pixelated performance, the deep thinker longs for realness, for slowness, for unedited presence. But those things don't trend. They don't sell, which is why you often feel like a ghost walking through a marketplace, watching everyone trade dopamine hits while your soul whispers, "Is this it?" Jaron Lanier, a pioneer in the tech world, warns that social media isn't just a tool, it's a behavioral modification system. It trains us to become predictable, reactive, emotionally shallow, and it does so quietly, invisibly, by changing how we define ourselves. So how do you resist? By reclaiming your mind, by making silence a ritual, not a luxury, by reading long-form content when your brain begs for highlights, by questioning your reactions, by choosing presence over performance. Most importantly, by realizing that your mind is not a battleground, it's a temple. And like any sacred space, it must be protected, not from others, but from the slow, daily erosion of meaning by manipulation. Carl Jung believed that media, if left unchecked, would become the new unconscious, a force that dictates thought from the shadows. But he also believed in the individual's power to resist, to awaken, to remember. So remember, your mind was not built to scroll. It was built to see, to seek, to know. And no algorithm should ever interrupt that. From a young age, deep thinkers start asking the kinds of questions that make classrooms uncomfortable. Why is this important? What if the teacher is wrong? Why do we have to memorize this instead of understanding it? And the response is rarely celebration. Because most education systems are not designed to awaken the soul, they're designed to standardize the mind. Carl Jung believed that true education should cultivate the individuation process, the journey of becoming one's most authentic self. But modern schooling, he argued, does the opposite. It rewards obedience over originality, repetition over reflection, compliance over curiosity. You're taught to sit still, raise your hand, wait your turn, follow the rubric. Not because that's what intelligence requires, but because that's what systems require. From the very first day, students are sorted, measured, compared. The ones who color inside the lines are praised. The ones who wander off into philosophical questions, metaphors, and unrelated tangents are told to focus. But focus on what? Exactly. On passing tests, on remembering dates, on answering questions in the format that earns points, not in the way that honors truth. So Ken Robinson, the late educational visionary, famously said, "We are educating people out of their creative capacities." He argued that children enter school brimming with divergent thinking, able to imagine, explore, connect ideas and leave with that capacity dulled, not by accident, by design. Because the system isn't built to cultivate inner worlds. It's built to prepare workers, not thinkers. And deep thinkers, they don't just want to work. They want to wonder. They want to ask, what makes life meaningful? Why are we here? Why do people suffer? What does justice really mean? But these aren't testable questions. They don't fit neatly into curriculum objectives. So they're pushed aside, minimized, and the student learns something not about the world, but about themselves. They learn that their questions are wrong, that their mind is inconvenient, that their truth is too much. Jiddu Krishnamurti, the Indian philosopher and educator, said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." He believed that education should be a journey of self-inquiry, not indoctrination. But to question the system from within it is a lonely path, one that most students are too afraid or too exhausted to follow. So they conform, or they disconnect, or, if they're like many deep thinkers, they go underground doing just enough to pass while secretly building an entire inner world no teacher ever sees. A world of questions, of quiet rebellion, of wonder that cannot be contained in multiple choice formats. Maria Montessori, one of the few educators who truly understood the inner life of the child, believed that education is not the filling of a bucket, but the lighting of a flame. She saw that every child carries a unique, sacred impulse to explore the world, and that real learning happens when we nurture that impulse, not suppress it. But how many schools are built to protect that flame? Most are built to control it, to tell the student, here's what matters, here's how you must think, here's how you must define success. Now memorize and obey. And for the deep thinker, that message doesn't just frustrate wounds, because it teaches them to mistrust their inner compass, to silence their wonder, to see their difference as a defect. But here's the truth. You are never wrong for asking more, for seeing deeper, for refusing to accept surface-level learning. What you experienced wasn't education, it was domestication. And now that you're older, the invitation returns. Will you continue to shrink for approval, or will you reignite the wonder they tried to extinguish? Because that wonder, the one you carried even as they tried to standardize you, is not gone. And it's sacred. There's a quiet violence in telling the truth, not because truth is cruel, but because it exposes, it doesn't shout or force. It simply shows, and in showing, it shatters the illusions people have spent their lives protecting. Deep thinkers are often this kind of truth, not by choice, but by presence. You walk into a room and sense the contradictions others ignore. You hear the laughter that's just a little too loud, the stories that hide more than they reveal. And you don't even have to say anything. Your silence alone becomes a mirror that reflects what others are trying to forget. And this is why people flinch around you. Not because you're unkind, not because you're rude, but because you see. Carl Jung believed that people defend themselves most violently not against lies, but against truths they are not ready to face. When someone refuses to confront their shadow, the parts of themselves they denied or rejected, they attack the one who reflects it. And that person is often you. You don't mean to confront them, you're just being honest. You say what you feel. You ask a real question. You point out the contradiction. And suddenly, the room grows cold. Someone laughs nervously. Another deflects. And one quietly distances themselves from you in the days that follow. This isn't personal, it's psychological. Ernest Becker, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning work, The Denial of Death, explains that most human behavior is rooted in a fear of mortality, of the unknown, of meaninglessness. To avoid confronting this, people construct what he calls immortality projects, narratives, routines, identities that help them feel secure. These illusions keep anxiety at bay. But when someone like you comes along, someone who questions, who sees through the script, you threaten those illusions, not because you're destructive, but because you're real. And realness cracks the veneer. Jordan Peterson often speaks of the psychological necessity of truth, how societies, families, and individuals become sick when truth is denied. He warns that avoiding uncomfortable truths doesn't protect us, it weakens us. It makes us brittle, defensive, hostile toward those who challenge the comfort of our delusions. And deep thinkers, they challenge without trying. They are the challenge. They read the friend who doesn't pretend everything's fine when it's clearly not. The partner who refuses to suppress what they feel just to keep the peace. The co-worker who questions a process that's always been done this way. The stranger whose quiet presence makes others feel strangely seen. It's not that you're better than anyone else. It's that you're unwilling or perhaps unable to pretend. And that refusal becomes a form of disruption. But disruption is sacred, because illusions don't just protect people. They imprison them. They keep them from truth, from healing, from growth. And sometimes it takes a mirror, hard, honest, uncomfortable mirror, to wake someone up. James Baldwin wrote, "You write in order to change the world." If you're going to change the world, you have to take it on piece by piece. It wasn't just speaking of writing. He was speaking of truth-telling in all forms. And truth doesn't always come in words. Sometimes it comes in presence, in the courage to not participate in the performance. But here's what few will tell you. You will lose people because of this. You will be misunderstood, criticized, labeled too much, too deep, too intense. People will say, "You think too much." What they really mean is, "You think beyond the boundaries I'm comfortable with." But don't dim your perception to make others more comfortable with theirs. You are not a threat. You are an invitation to step into the light, to confront the shadow, to replace illusion with truth. And those who are ready will recognize it not with resistance, but with relief. Not everyone is meant to walk into the fire of their own soul and come out transformed. Not everyone is meant to question the world, deconstruct it, and then try to love it anyway. But some are. And if you're a deep thinker, if you've carried the ache of awareness, the burden of honesty, the exhaustion of feeling everything, you may be one of them. Carl Jung called it a psychological destiny. He believed that certain individuals were born with a kind of inner manditude break from the mass-mindedness of the crowd, to descend into the unconscious, to face the shadow and to emerge with wisdom not just for themselves but for others. This journey is not glamorous, it's not celebrated. In fact, it often begins in exile. The deep thinker becomes the outsider not because they're antisocial but because they refuse to be inauthentic. They sense the falseness in culture, in roles, in rituals that no longer hold meaning. And so they begin to strip away the masks, not only their own, but the ones others wear too. That stripping is painful, but it's sacred. Khalil Gibran in The Prophet wrote, "The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain." The deep thinker knows his truth intimately. They carry both grief and beauty in equal measure. Their mind questions, but their soul listens. And over time, they become a kind of vessel not just for thoughts, but for insight, for pattern, for truth. But that truth is rarely intellectual alone. It's existential, it's spiritual. Deep thinkers often find themselves drawn to myth, to metaphor, to the language beneath the language. They dream vividly. They intuit things before they're spoken. They carry memories of wounds they never received firsthand. They feel the echo of something ancient in their bone. This isn't fantasy. It's archetypal consciousness, the recognition that your life is part of something bigger than personal success, that your thoughts, your questions, your pain matter not just for you, but for the collective. Clarissa Pinkola writes of this in Women Who Run with the Wolves. She says that some souls are sent to the edge of the village not to be excluded, but to be initiated, to see what others won't see, to return with medicine. Not the kind you swallow, but the kind you become. Your presence becomes a medicine. Your refusal to lie becomes a mirror. Your capacity to feel becomes a bridge for others to feel too. This is the spiritual role of the deep thinker, not to escape the world, but to re-enter it changed, with deeper compassion, with clearer perception, with a heart broken open wide enough to hold paradox, joy and sorrow, hope and realism, love and loss. Viktor Frankl, whose soul endured the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust, said that life is never made unbearable by circumstance but only by lack of meaning. The deep thinker doesn't seek comfort, they seek meaning. And when they find it, or even a glimpse of it, they carry it like a torch through the darkness. That torch is not for ego. It's not to appear enlightened or wise. It's to light the path of Anne if no one follows. That's the burden, and that's the gift. You may never be fully understood. You may always feel just a little too much, a little too far, a little too different. But know this, you are not here to be understood by everyone. You are here to awaken the few, to embody what others are afraid to feel, to live what others are afraid to imagine, to be what others are afraid to become. You're not broken. You're initiated. And the world needs you especially now. In a world where most conversations skim the surface, where silence is feared and truth is filtered, meeting another deep thinker can feel like finding a rare oasis in a desert of noise. There's no need for performance, no need to shrink or simplify, no need to preface your thoughts with "sorry if this is too much," because the other person already knows. They've felt the same ache, carried the same questions, endured the same loneliness that comes from seeing the world too clearly and too deeply. Carl Jung believed that true connection begins not at the level of personality, but at the level of the self, the deeper, archetypal core of who we are. And when two individuals who have done their inner work meet, who have both wrestled with their shadows, questioned the illusions, and committed to growth, a different kind of dialogue begins. It's not small talk, it's soul talk. You start in one place, maybe a book, a dream, a lingering feeling, and suddenly you're somewhere else entirely. Talking about death, God, beauty, grief, legacy, the shape of your childhood wounds, the scent of an unfinished longing. And there's no rush to fix or finish the conversation. There's room for silence, for sacred pauses, for depth that doesn't demand answers. Rumi, the 13th century mystic, wrote, "The soul has been given its own ears to hear things the mind does not understand." When two deep thinkers meet, their souls recognize each other before their minds do. It's not romantic, though it can be. It's not intellectual, though ideas may flow. It's something older, something the world doesn't often name, but every deep thinker has longed for: resonance without reduction. You don't have to explain the way your heart aches during a sunset or why a piece of music makes you cry. They already get it. You don't have to defend your intensity or justify your solitude. They've lived it too. And in that recognition, something beautiful happens. You begin to soften. You begin to breathe differently, because you are no longer alone in your language. Bell Hooks often emphasized that real love is the will to nurture one S on and another S, spiritual growth. When two deep thinkers find each other, this love can blossom, not just in romance, but in friendship, mentorship, or even a brief moment of soul meeting. It's a relationship that doesn't feed on comfort alone. It feeds on truth, on mutual becoming, on the willingness to hold space for what is raw, unresolved, and still unfolding. These relationships may be rare, but they are transformational. They realign your sense of self. They remind you that your inner world is not Midnasset's music, that your longings are not dramatic, they are divine signals, that your questions are not evidence of confusion but the beginning of wisdom. Parker Palmer, educator and spiritual thinker, said, "The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed to, be seen, heard, and companioned exactly as it is." When two deep thinkers meet, they witness each other without trying to fix, without interrupting, without judgment. And sometimes, that's all we've ever needed. Just one other person to say, "I see it too. I feel it too. You're not crazy. You're just awake." These moments do not always last forever, but they matter forever. Because once you've been truly seen, you cannot go back to pretending. You realize that connection is not about finding a crowd. It is about finding one soul who meets you at the depth you've ever spent your life swimming in alone. And when you find that, the whole world feels a little less silent. There comes a point in every deep thinker's life where they begin to wonder, would life be easier if I were just quieter, simpler, less? This is not a question born of arrogance, but of exhaustion. After years of being misunderstood, of watching eyes glaze over when you share what excites you, of being labeled too much or too serious or too intense, you start to wonder if the world would love you more if you toned it down. So you begin to edit yourself. You leave parts of your thoughts unsaid. You smile when you want to question. You water down your wonder. You laugh along with jokes that don't land in your soul. And piece by piece, you trade your truth for belonging. But that trade comes at a cost. Carl Jung warned that when we abandon our authentic self for the sake of adaptation, we split from our own psyche. We create a divide between who we are and who we present. And over time, this disconnection creates not only emotional suffering but spiritual disorder. Because no matter how well you play the part, there's a voice inside you whispering, "This isn't me." That voice is your lifeline. The truth is, your mind is not something to apologize for. Your sensitivity, your pattern recognition, your existential questions, your philosophical spirals at 3 a.m. These are not glitches. They are gifts. But we live in a culture that doesn't recognize these gifts. Instead, it pathologizes them. Overthinking. The over is the world's way of saying, "This makes me uncomfortable." Brown speaks to this in her work on shame and belonging. She explains that the root of shame isn't being wrong, it's being different. That's what stings. Not the rejection itself, but the message it carries. You don't belong here as you are. And for deep thinkers, that message often starts in childhood. They're told to stop asking so many questions, to stop being so emotional, to stop living in their heads. And over time, they internalize the idea that their depth is a burden to others and perhaps even to themselves. But here's what the world rarely tells you. Your mind isn't the problem. It's a mirror. And some people aren't ready to see their own reflection. That doesn't mean you should shatter the mirror. It means you should stop apologizing for holding it. Emily Dickinson, a poet whose quiet brilliance was never fully recognized in her lifetime, once wrote, "The brain is wider than the sky." She knew what it meant to feel deeply and see clearly in a world that preferred surface and speed. Her solitude became sanctuary, her introspection, poetry. And though she rarely left her house, she traveled more in thought than most do in a lifetime. You don't need to write like Dickinson to claim the same freedom. You simply need to own the mind you've been given. James Hillman, the depth psychologist, believed that every soul carries a calling, a unique psychic fingerprint that shows up in our curiosities, our wounds, our fascinations. He said that the task of life is not to conform to society's image of success, but to remain faithful to the image that lives within us. So when you find yourself apologizing for your complexity or curiosity, your inability to just go with the flow, stop and ask yourself, whose comfort am I protecting by shrinking my truth? Because every time you apologize for your mind, you're reinforcing the idea that intelligence must be that emotion must be diluted, that insight must be softened. But what if it doesn't? What if your mind just as it is medicine for someone else? What if your way of thinking is not an obstacle to connection, but the key to a kind of connection the world is starving for? You don't owe anyone a watered-down version of yourself. What you owe to your soul, to your purpose, to the life waiting for you is to stop apologizing and start Somewhere along the way, someone looked at your unfiltered expression, your depth, your questions, your honesty, and called it too much. And because you were young, or tender, or hopeful, you believed them. You believed that your emotions were excessive, that your voice was too loud, that your thoughts were too complicated, that your desire for real conversation, for presence, for something more, made you inconvenient. But let's be clear, you were never too much. You were just too real for a world that often runs on pretense. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He knew that the process of becoming whole, the journey toward individuation, requires breaking away from collective illusions. It requires standing in your truth, even when others are committed to their masks. And that kind of truth-telling, that kind of presence, doesn't always get applause. Sometimes it gets silence, sometimes it gets sight, sometimes it gets people walking away without explanation. Because realness exposes, and what you expose is not just you, but them. Their unresolved pain, their buried grief, their unspoken questions. And for many it's easier to label you too much than it is to admit, I'm not ready to meet you at that depth. But here's what you must remember. Your intensity is not aggression. Your questions are not rebellion. Your emotions are not a spectacle. Your passion is not a performance. They are truths. And truths are disruptive not because they are wrong, but because they don't fit into the roles people have settled into. Rainer Maria Rilke, the poet of the soul, once wrote, I want to be with those who know secret things, or else alone. He knew that some souls crave communion beyond convention, that there is a hunger for meaning that small talk cannot touch, that when you live from your depths, your solitude becomes sacred not because you don't want connection, but because you refuse to dilute yourself just to be included. Still, it's hard. You will be misunderstood not because your truth is flawed, but because it challenges carefully constructed narratives. You will be called intense, dramatic, even arrogant not because you are, but because others are projecting their own discomfort onto your freedom. But as Martha Graham, the legendary dancer, once said, there is a vitality, a life force, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And if you block it, it will never exist through any other medium and it will be lost. You weren't meant to shrink. You weren't meant to smooth out your edges for the comfort of others. You were meant to radiate, even if that light makes others squint, even if it reveals shadows they're not ready to face. Because someone out there is starving for exactly the kind of realness you've been hiding. Someone who has also been called too much. Someone who has also carried questions in silence. Someone who has been waiting for permission to feel, to speak, to be. And your realness, that's their permission slip. David Whyte, poet and philosopher, writes, the courageous conversation is the one you're not having. But deep thinkers have those conversations every day, first with themselves, then with the world. And though it's lonely, it's also liberating. Because once you stop apologizing for who you are, you begin to attract those who never asked you to. You begin to resonate instead of just relate. You begin to find home not in places, but in people who see you instead. So let the world call you too much. Smile gently and go even deeper. Because your truth isn't a burden, it's a beacon. And someone out there is lost in the dark, waiting for the light. You no longer need permission to shine. For years you may have felt like a misfit in the world, too sensitive to stay numb, too awake to blend in, too honest to be popular. So you learned to hide, not visibly, but energetically. You smiled more than you wanted to. You nodded when you disagreed. You turned the volume down on your truth just enough to not scare people away. But here is the irony. The very people who would truly resonate with you, the ones whose souls echo your own canteen, find you while you re in hiding. Carl Jung taught that individuation is not only about self-realization, but about integration into the collective in a new way. Once you've faced your shadow, once you've embraced your depth, the next step is embodiment. Living your truth. Not just knowing who you are, but being who you are, publicly, unapologetically. Yet many deep thinkers hesitate at this edge, because they've learned the hard way that truth can be met with silence, presence with projection, and depth with distance. So they build protective shells. They become the wise observer, the lone wolf, the quiet empath in the back of the room. They wait, longing to be found. But hiding makes it almost impossible. You can't attract real connection while disguising your real self. You don't have to be loud or performative, but you do have to be visible in your own way. Whether it's through your art, your presence, your words, or your silence, you have to risk being seen. Clarissa Pinkola-Stay's Women Who Run with the Wolves tells us that the wild soul must not live in exile. She writes, to be ourselves causes us to be exiled by many others, and yet to comply with what others want causes us to be exiled from ourselves. This is the crossroads every deep thinker eventually reaches. Hide and be accepted but by people who don't truly know you, or emerge and be rejected but open the door to being truly met. The truth is, there are people who crave what you are, people who ask the same impossible questions, who get overwhelmed by beauty, who want to talk about the nature of truth at 2 a.m., who feel things deeply and are unashamed of it, who aren't threatened by your depth, but nourished by it. But they will never find you if you're busy trying to appear normal. They're not looking for a mirror of the mainstream. They're listening for the resonance of realness. Howard Thurman, mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., once said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, and go do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. When you come alive, when you embody your depth, you send a frequency into the world that cannot be faked or mistaken. It calls others in. Not everyone, but the right ones. And when they find you, it won't feel like being discovered. It'll feel like being remembered, because souls like yours were never meant to be universally accepted. They were meant to be recognized by the few who carry a similar flame. Ram Dass once said, "We're all just walking each other home." But we can't walk each other home if we're hiding behind the hedges, afraid of being seen. So come out of the cave, not all at once, not with a spotlight, but with intention, with presence, with a quiet courage to stop apologizing for who you are and start offering it, because you are not alone. And the moment you show up fully is the moment your people can finally find you. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the ache of not being seen. Solitude is the sanctuary of seeing yourself. And for the deep thinker, solitude is not just a preference, it's a requirement. Not as an escape, but as a return. A return to clarity, to presence, to the voice within that's too often drowned out by the noise of the world. Carl Jung often spoke of the necessity of solitude. He believed that the journey toward wholeness, a process of individuation, requires periods of withdrawal, not as a retreat from life, but as a recentering, as he put it. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. To look inside, you must step away. You must step away from the performances, the timelines, the curated conversations. You must leave behind the social rhythms that demand constant response and availability. And in the stillness, something ancient stirs. You begin to hear yourself, your real self, not the version shaped by the room you're in, not the one edited for approval, but the voice that existed before the world told you who to be. That voice is quiet. It doesn't shout, it waits. And solitude is where you finally learn to listen. Rainer Maria Rilke, in his letters to a young poet, encouraged his reader not to fear solitude, but to trust it, to treat it as the space where one's truest work begins. He wrote, "A person who has no solitude is not like one who suffers it, for to be alone is a great, great thing." Rilke knew that creativity, transformation, and even love begin with solitude, because until you know how to sit with yourself, you can't fully meet another. But we live in a culture that as if quietness is a condition to be fixed. They wonder, don't you get lonely? When you choose a night of stillness over a crowd, they assume something's wrong when you enjoy your own company. But the deep thinker knows the truth. The real danger is not being alone. It's being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen. Thomas Merton, the monk and mystic, believed that solitude wasn't a rejection of the world, but a way to re-enter it transformed. In his monastery cell, he wrote some of the most profound spiritual insights of the modern age, not because he escaped life, but because he entered it more deeply. He called solitude a kind of sacred furnace where the ego is stripped away and the soul is clarified. For the deep thinker, solitude is where insight crystallizes. It's where complex thoughts are allowed to unfold without interruption, where feelings that were dismissed in public are finally honored, where grief gets a voice, where dreams start to take shape again, where the soul is heard. And yet, solitude does more than restore, it prepares. Because when you return from solitude, you bring something with you. A steadiness, a perspective, a kind of presence that can only be forged in the fire of being alone without being lonely. May Sarton, poet and mystic, wrote, "Loneliness is the poverty of self. Solitude is the richness of self." And in a society obsessed with being seen, solitude teaches you how to see yourself, to be enough without an audience, to be full without performance, to be you without compromise. So if you've ever felt guilty for needing time alone, or worry that solitude means something is wrong, you can let that go. Your solitude isn't selfish, it's sacred. And the more you honor it, the more whole you become. Because the world doesn't just need your presence, it needs your presence, rested, centered, and rooted in truth. And solitude is where that version of you is born. In a world that thrives on pretense, realness is not just refreshing, it's revolutionary. The deep thinker often wrestles with this paradox. You weren't trying to be a healer, you were just trying to be honest, to make sense of what you felt, to speak without a script, to live without numbing. And yet, in doing so, in simply being who you became something powerful. You became medicine. Carl Jung believed that the path to healing isn't paved with techniques or formulas, it begins with authenticity. When a person dares to integrate the shadow, confront the pain, and embrace the complexity of their being, they become a vessel for transformation, not only for themselves, but for others. Jung called this the wounded healer archetype, the one whose very scars become the salve for someone else's silent wounds. You don't need to be a therapist or a guru to embody this role. You just need to be real. Real in your grief, real in your joy, real in your fear and your fire and your quiet wondering. Because that realness, raw, imperfect, unfiltered, is exactly what so many are starving for. People don't need more noise. They need depth. They don't need more advice. They need presence. They don't need another hero. They need someone who shows them it's okay to be human. James Baldwin once said, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, But then you read, and then you meet someone who has lived through their own calm survived. Someone who didn't have all the answers, but refused to stop asking the questions. Someone who didn't hide their complexity just to be liked. That someone could be you. Thomas More, in Care of the Soul, reminds us that healing happens not through perfection, but through soulfulness. Through the simple act of staying close to what is real. Through storytelling, stillness, tears, truth. Not the polished kind of truth, but the trembling kind. The kind that says, I don't know how to fix this, but I won't pretend it doesn't hurt. Your realness is not a performance. It's an invitation to slow down, to feel more, to stop pretending, to begin again. Clarissa Pinkola writes, we do not become healers. We came as healers we are. Some of us are still catching up to what we are. You don't have to try harder to become who you're meant to be. You only need to stop resisting the truth that's been rising inside you all along. This is what makes your presence medicine. You normalize depth, you name what others avoid. You feel what others repress. You say the hard thing gently but unapologetically. And the people who are ready, truly ready, will feel something crack open in your presence. They won't be able to explain it, but they'll leave feeling lighter, more seen, more awake, more human. And maybe they'll finally stop pretending to. That's the quiet miracle of your authenticity. It's not loud, it's not viral, but it ripples. It ripples through families, friendships, works, relationships, through every space that's been waiting for someone to say, let's stop performing, let's be real. So go first, not perfectly, but honestly, because every time you choose truth over performance, presence over pretending, you become the reminder someone didn't know they needed. That it's okay to be whole, not flawless, not impressive, just whole. And in a fragmented world, wholeness is the most powerful thing you can offer. At some point you stop chasing the crowd. You stop trying to win over everyone, to be universally understood, to please people who are only comfortable with the version of you that stays silent. You stop adjusting your truth to fit their tolerance. You stop apologizing for your edges, your emotions, your insight, your intensity, and something sacred happens. You begin to awaken the few. Carl Jung warned against the trap of collective conformity, not only for society, but for the soul. He believed that every person is called to individuate, to become a whole self rather than a reflection of the group. But that calling is not popular. It does not guarantee praise or acceptance. In fact, it almost always begins with the loss of approval, of ease, of the illusion of belonging. But what you gain is far more powerful, the ability to walk in your own light, even if you walk alone. Søren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, once said, the crowd is untruth. He didn't mean that people are bad, he meant that when individuals merge into the mass, they lose the responsibility of thinking and feeling for themselves. The crowd follows the loudest voice, the safest answer, the least resistance. But the deep thinker can't follow that path, not because they are rebellious, but because they are awake. And with that awakening comes a shift. You realize your presence isn't meant to entertain the crowd. It's meant to activate the few. Those few may not look like you. They may not be loud. They may not even respond right away. But they're listening, quietly, deeply. They feel something move in your presence, even if they don't know how to name it. You become the key that unlocks something they've kept locked for years, the courage to question, to feel, to remember who they are beneath a persona. Etty Hillesum, the mystic and diarist who wrote from inside the terror of Nazi-occupied Europe, once observed that her only duty was to listen to her soul and be obedient to it. She believed that awakening was not an outer revolution, but an inner clarity, a light that, once ignited, can't help but offer warmth to others. But that light isn't meant for stadiums. It's meant for souls. You're not here to convert the masses. You're not here to impress the algorithm. You're here to speak to the few who feel the AQV carried in silence. The ones who lay awake at night asking, is there anyone else who feels this deeply? Yes, there is, and your realness will be the answer to their question. Krishnamurti said, it is no sign of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. You are not here to adjust. You are here to interrupt, to slow the pace, to ask the question that pierces the performance, to remind others of what they've buried under years of pleasing and pretending. But don't expect a parade. Often, the awakening happens quietly, in private. A stranger watching your video, a reader pausing mid-sentence, heart cracked open, a friend rethinking a belief because of something you said weeks ago. You won't always see the impact, but it's there. It ripples, and that ripple begins with one choice. The decision to stop performing and start offering. Not offering answers, but presence. Not offering perfection, but truth. Not offering yourself to the crowd, but to the few who are finally ready to come alive. Because when you stop trying to please the many, you begin to find the meaning behind your voice. You're not here for everyone. You never were. But for the ones you are here for, you're everything. Every deep thinker, at some point, comes to a crossroads. One path leads back into the shadows toward shrinking, softening, hiding. The other asks for something terrifying and holy, to shine. Not with arrogance, not for applause, but with the quiet authority of someone who has seen, felt, and endured and now chooses to be visible, not despite the pain but because of it. Carl Jung described this moment as the beginning of individuation, the full birth of the true self. It is not a flash of inspiration, but a crucible, a confrontation with the inner question, will I live aligned with my soul, even if the world misunderstands? Most people never reach this place. They stay wrapped in comfort, conformity, and masks. But for those who have carried the weight of insight, the cost of truth, the sting of rejection, this choice is sacred, and it is not made once, it is made daily. You feel it every time you speak your mind in a room of silence, every time you say no to something that would have made you small, every time you sit with discomfort rather than perform for approval. Marianne Williamson said it best: our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. As we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. This is the paradox of deep thinkers. The world often resists your presence until you fully embody it. People don't know how to respond to someone who doesn't beg for validation, who simply stands real and rooted in their truth. But deep down, they crave it. Not your approval, but your example. Your courage awakens courage. But first, you must face the fear that you'll lose more people, the fear that you'll be labeled difficult, arrogant, dramatic, the fear that your realness will cost you comfort, reputation, even love. And here's the hard truth: it might, but what's the alternative? To shrink, to live up, to betray your own knowing just to be tolerated. Viktor Frankl, writing from the deepest horrors of human suffering, taught that the last and greatest human freedom is the ability to choose one's attitude, one's posture toward life. And for the deep thinker, that posture is this: I will not shrink to fit into something that dishonors my truth. I will not betray my depth just to be understood. I will not dim my insight to make others more comfortable with their ignorance. Because once you know what you know, once you've seen, you can't pretend anymore. You can't go back to living a second-hand life. John O'Donoghue, the Irish poet and philosopher, wrote, "There is a quiet light that shines in every heart. It draws no attention, but its presence is what allows us to truly live. That light is your essence, your voice, your realness, your inner fire. And when you choose to shine, even quietly, even tremblings align with that essence, you stop surviving, you start living." So this is the choice: shrink to be accepted, or shine to be free. The world will not beg you to rise. It'll offer you every incentive to stay small, but your soul is not here to be manageable. It is here to illuminate. And if you choose that path, if you choose to shine, you won't walk alone. Because the moment you step into your fullness, the ones who've been waiting for you, watching for you, aching for someone like you, they will rise too. And together, your light will not only burn brighter, it will burn away the illusion that you ever needed to shrink at all. You've walked a long path, through silence and solitude, through rejection and reflection, through questions that never found easy answers, and emotions that ran deeper than words could carry. You've carried weight no one recognized, and insight no one invited. And for much of the journey it felt like you were walking alone. But you weren't, you were walking ahead. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he also warned that this privilege is costly. It asks you to leave behind the crowd, to unlearn the rules, to face your shadows, and still to love yourself enough to return to the world with your wholeness intact. You are not just a thinker. You are a threshold being, one who stands between two worlds. The world that performs and the world that feels. The world that numbs and the world that heals. The world that forgets and the world that remembers. And your task, though few will understand it, is to remember out loud, to speak what others bury, to hold what others discard, to live with eyes open, heart open, even when the world demands that you look away. Khalil Gibran once said, "The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain." That is the paradox of the deep thinker. Your depth is not a burden, it is a vessel. The more you've allowed yourself to feel, the more capacity you've created, not just for sorrow, but for joy, for love, for presence. And that presence is your gift. The world doesn't need more experts. It needs more witnesses. Witnesses to truth, witnesses to beauty, witnesses to pain, witnesses to the sacred that still lives in every ordinary moment. And Lamotte writes, "Lighthouses don't go running all over an island looking for boats to save. They just stand there shining." You don't have to chase people to prove your worth. You don't have to soften your truth to make it more palatable. You don't have to wait to be chosen. You already are chosen by life, by your soul, by this exact moment in time. Just stand there. Just be you. Just shine. Because somewhere, someone is lost in the same dark you once wandered through, and your light, your words, your presence might be the silent whisper that says, "You're not alone. Keep going." This is the great purpose of the deep thinker, not to fix the world but to light a way through it. And that light may not always be recognized, but it will always be felt. Teilhard de Chardin believed that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience, we are spiritual beings having a human one. And in that human experience, we are called to awaken, to embody, to become, not someone new, but someone whole. So if this journey has made you feel seen, if these words echoed something buried deep within you that the world never quite touched, let that be a sign. You are not broken, you are becoming, and you are not too much. You are exactly enough for the task you were sent here to do. Live your truth, speak your depth, protect your peace, guard your joy, honor your mind, and never again ask for permission to be what you already are. The quiet revolution the world didn't see coming but desperately needs.